Hey gang, welcome back to another video. So this week's build is inspired by a recent episode of The Skeleton Crew that featured a droid many of us will remember from Return of the Jedi. Now if you said the Gatekeeper Droid, you'd be right, and it's something I've always wanted to build. So let's get into it. The core parts of this build start with some links of PVC and ABS pipe, as well as some pipe fittings. This blueprint should help to visualize it a bit better, rather than you watching me cut a bunch of pieces of pipe. The 2-inch ABS pipe was set over the 1-inch PVC coupler by grinding away some of the inside edge and then pressing it into place using my vise. Admittedly, I wasn't sure it was going to work and didn't film it as it was happening, but the fact that you're seeing it now means that it was a success. And when they're all assembled, they look like this. To help with the build, I've made myself a few templates, which I'll link to in the video description if you'd like to download them to make your own. These templates will provide me with the location of the mounting holes for the lower hinge pieces, as well as the support bars. And once I've cut them out, I can center them up and tape them to the pipe pieces and get to drilling. After drilling the ABS pipe, I switched to a smaller bit, since I found that the smaller bit kept it from moving too much at the start of each hole. When I had the mounting holes drilled, I switched over to a step-up bit to enlarge the holes where the support rods will go. The size of these holes is dependent on the support rods I'll be using, which are a bit unconventional, but more on that later. With the mounting holes drilled, I could set the main pipe aside and switch to a much larger piece of pipe. This is a 1-inch slice from a 6¼ inch diameter PVC pipe that I'll be using for the 2 hinge detail pieces. And with my template in hand, I can get to marking out and cutting the slices I'll need with a pipe cutter. When I had my 4 slices, I grabbed my template again and marked off where the fin details will be placed. These templates are a lot easier than measuring for me since my design software will evenly space all of the marking points, and will be a lot more accurate than I would be with a ruler. Next up is to add the pivot detail using these 1-inch by 1/2 inch nylon spacers. I'll glue one to each end of the short piece, and the remaining spacer to one end of the long piece. And when the glue is set, I can temporarily attach them to the main pipe to ensure proper alignment and glue them in position. Once I've got everything glued, I can go back and add more glue around the spacers to act as a gusset, which will make these connections a lot more durable, and will fill in any small gaps. And to speed up the process, I'll spray a bit of accelerator to help the glue set up more quickly. The last thing to do on these hinge pieces is to add the fins. I had intended to cut them from some 1/4 inch MDF, but didn't have enough on hand, and instead cut some out of 1/4 inch acrylic, which then got glued into position. A quick test fit to see how my Gatekeeper Droid is coming along, and then I can shift my attention to the support arms. And for that, I'll need a coat hanger. When I was trying to come up with a less 3D print dependent version of this prop, I realized that plastic coat hangers would be a good substitute. So I grabbed my pipe cutters and cut off the lower edge of the hanger, making sure to leave as much of the side curvature intact, and once the piece was free from the rest of the hanger, I could split it at the midpoint, and now I've got my support arms. The next part of this build required me to move inside the shop and block out all of the sunlight, because I'll be taking this 5-inch plastic ornament, cutting it in half with a razor blade, and then filling it with these teardrop-shaped acrylic beads. But the reason I blocked out the sunlight is because I'll be setting them in place with a bit of crystal clear UV reactive resin. My plan is to coat the inside of the ornament and then add all of the gems with the hope that they'll get stuck in the resin. Then I'll press them down to make sure the longest edges of the gems are flat against the inside of the ornament and in contact with the resin. Then I can hit it with some UV light to permanently set them in place. Once the resin had cured, I could flip it over to see how I'd done. Now it's not too bad. There's a few small air bubbles that got trapped in the resin, but once it's in place, I don't know that anyone will notice. After a quick resin cleanup, I gave the hinge pieces a coat of primer to make them a uniform color and could get to adding on the spikes and tube details. Admittedly, these should have been glued in place before primer, but sometimes I get ahead of myself. All of these parts were 3D printed, but could have easily been made out of a bit of tubing and some sharpened dowels. With all of my off-the-shelf parts accounted for, it was time for paint. But before I could do that, I needed to remove the printing from the PVC pipes with a bit of painter's solvent. At the outset of this project, I had intended on making the eye section by hand, but the 6-inch acrylic spheres I ordered got lost in transit, and so I fired up my printer to make these pieces, which got sanded, primed, sanded again, and now along with the hinge pieces and support bars, will get painted in a hammered copper spray paint. This paint goes on a bit differently than your standard colors and took a few coats to get it done, but the depth in the finish looks awesome. By this point it had gotten a bit too dark to film, but I did paint up the PVC pipe pieces, and that means in the morning I can finally get to assembly. And here's the bulk of the Gatekeeper Droid, including a base that I 3D modeled, printed, and painted. I also got all of the support rods in place and could get to adding on the side hinges. These screw heads will need to get covered, so I made some caps for them and will glue them in place with some 5-minute epoxy. I also attached the lower lid of the eye as well as some styrene tabs to help with alignment and to give me a better gluing surface, rather than to try and apply glue along the bottom edge of the part. I set the bulk of the prop aside for a bit and glued the resin-encased gems into the eye socket with epoxy, as well as a NeoPixel ring for a light effect. This will be controlled by an Arduino Nano and is running a bit of code that I found online, and slightly modified to look a bit more like what we see on screen. The last thing to do is to add in some spacers for the inner sphere with a bit of epoxy, and then I can get the socket and bottom lid glued into place.
Five minutes later.
I decided not to glue the top lid in place should I want to add sound or make changes to the microcontroller, and in the future I'll figure out a more long-term solve. But for now, it's resting in place and I can get to weathering. And rather than using oil paints like I typically do, I'm going to do all my weathering with an airbrush. I started by dusting the entire droid to give a quick overall oiliness to the piece, and then would go back in and flood areas to give it a dark, grungy appearance. To mix up my weathering a bit, I grabbed a can of hairspray and used an old weathering trick I learned from miniature model makers. The hairspray temporarily reactivates the airbrush paint, and you can manipulate it into interesting and organic textures. This is a good way to bring back some of the metallic shine that was dulled down by the dark brown wash that I sprayed over the entire piece. I applied this little trick around the prop and alternated between a small brush and a rag to help vary the look. And when I was happy with how everything was looking, I grabbed my Fuller's Earth powder and gave all of the joints a good dusting and locked it in with a satin clear coat. And this Gatekeeper Droid was done. Now I just need to plug it in. Now hopefully in the future I can revisit this project to make it a bit more interactive, but for now it'll be a great addition to my growing collection of droids. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.